a former county commissioner. The two are in a special runoff election for the Democratic nomination in Georgia's 4th Congressional District. Co-hosted by Georgia Public Broadcasting and the Atlanta Press Club, it's 30 minutes.
Atlanta Press Club Debates 2006. The Democratic primary runoff debate for the 4th Congressional District is brought to you from Georgia Public Broadcasting. Here is the moderator for tonight's debate.
Good evening. I'm Morris Diggs from WAGA Fox 5. Welcome to our continuing series of Georgia primary election campaign debates, originating from the studios of Georgia Public Broadcasting. Tonight's debate is organized by the Atlanta Press Club. We also welcome the statewide audience of GPB's radio network, which is simulcasting this debate. Now, let's meet the candidates facing one another in Georgia's Democratic primary runoff for the 4th Congressional District. They are in alphabetical order. Henry Hank Johnson Jr. was a DeKalb County Commissioner for 5 years, and Cynthia McKinney is the current U.S. Representative for the 4th District and lives in Decatur. Those are the candidates. Here's the format for tonight's debate. In the first round, each candidate will answer one question. 1 minute will be allotted for each answer. 30 seconds will be allowed for a rebuttal. As moderator, I will determine if a rebuttal is appropriate. In the second round, the candidates will question one another, and in the third round, our panelists will continue the questioning. At the end of the question and answer period, each candidate will make a 30-second closing statement. Now, let's meet our panel of prominent Georgia journalists selected by the Atlanta Press Club. They are James Salser, is a staff writer with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Alexa Scott is publisher of the Atlanta Daily World. And David Zelski is a reporter and senior producer for Georgia Public Broadcasting. In this round, the order of candidates to be questioned has been randomly selected. Panelists, please limit your questions to 15 seconds. We begin with James Salser's question for Hank Johnson.
Good evening. I want to read the text of an ad that's been put out, and I want to get your response to it. It says, as County Commissioner Hank Johnson had an ethics complaint filed against him for illegal use of campaign funds. He had conflict of interest when he took money from landfill developers at a time when landfill issues were before the commission. He had several lawsuits and garnishments filed against him for unpaid debts. He didn't even pay his taxes and he filed for bankruptcy. I'd like to have your comment on those allegations.
Well, I think it was a desperate act by a desperate candidate seeking to use truth or distort truth to gain re-election. The allegations are partially correct. I've had some financial problems that arose in the 80s, 87 through 89, that involved the non-payment of some taxes. I paid those taxes 100%. It was a humbling experience to go through bankruptcy. It was good because I know how my constituents feel when they're in a tight squeeze. I'm a business owner, small business owner, but I'm happy to report that since the mid-90s, my affairs have been in order. And so this allegation was just simply a desperate attempt by a desperate candidate to try to inflict some personal damage on this candidacy. Quite frankly, it was the politics of personal destruction. And in addition to that, she's been the candidate of polarization and divisiveness, so I'm not surprised that she would use this issue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. Ms. McKinney, Mr. Johnson called you desperate.
That's far from the case. Let me also just say that, unfortunately, instead of keeping his promises to pay, Mr. Johnson failed to pay all of his creditors. In addition to that, we had a town hall meeting, and Mr. Johnson was the co-host of the town hall meeting. Unfortunately, it was on landfills, and he had taken money from landfill operators, and no one in the room knew, except, of course, Mr. Johnson.
Alexa Scott, it's now your turn to ask a question of Ms. McKinney. Quickly, very quickly.
All right, thank you. Congresswoman McKinney knows that it's not true. I've never taken a contribution from a landfill operator. She knows that that's not true. I've never had a complaint, an ethics complaint filed against me for taking money from a landfill operator. And so that's just patently false. She knows it's false.
Thank you very much. You all will have a chance to go back and forth at each other in that round. Okay.
Thank you.
Alexa Scott, your chance for a question now for Ms. McKinney.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Your critics have said that you are an embarrassment to voters in your district. Do you think that the confrontation with the Capitol Police and your reaction to it cost you receiving the majority of votes in the July 18th primary?
I'm glad you asked that question, because the fact of the matter is I was never charged with anything. But let me just say that I have been scored by Congress.org. And according to Congress.org, I have the highest legislative record, success record, of any of the Democrats in the Georgia delegation, and that's including Congressman John Lewis.
Thank you, Ms. McKinney. That concludes round one of questions. In the second round, the candidates do have the opportunity to ask 2 questions of their opponent. Please limit those questions to 30 seconds. 1 minute will be allowed for answers, and the questioner then has 30 seconds for rebuttal. The order of questions has been determined by random drawing. The first question will be asked by Hank Johnson.
Yes, thank you. Ms. McKinney, you call yourself a champion of the environment, and yet you were missing in action when Congress voted to make the Arabia Mountain right here in your district a national heritage site. You call yourself a champion for working people, and yet you were missing in action when Congress voted in an attempt to raise the minimum wage for the first time in a decade. You call yourself a champion of democracy and civil rights, and yet you were missing in action when your Democratic colleagues voted to stop an amendment that would have gutted the Voting Rights Act. If the Voting Rights Act was not important enough for you to show up, then what is important for you to show up?
Thank you very much. Let me just say that I have a 94% voting record in Congress. I take my job very seriously, and my constituents know that. At the same time, let me also say that we are in this position today because the Voting Rights Act and its problems in terms of the open primary and the second primary statutes in the state of Georgia is unfinished business for our state. In Mississippi, there is litigation now challenging the open primary. But how is it that Republicans in Texas can say that Democrats don't have any business getting involved in the primary in Texas, but Republicans in Georgia want to dictate who the Democratic nominee in this election is going to be?
Mr. Johnson, would you like to rebut?
Yes. During this primary, the run-up to the primary, we got into this runoff with $120,000 of locally donated money. And the votes came from Democrats, and I am a lifelong Democrat. I'm a progressive Democrat. Congresswoman McKinney knows that I'm a Democrat, and so this is another desperate attempt by a desperate candidate.
Ms. McKinney, you have a question for Hank Johnson.
I certainly do, Mr. Johnson. In your TV ad, you say you'll be a voice of reason and sound judgment in Congress. Here are a few simple yes or no questions regarding your sound judgment. Was it sound judgment when you took money from landfill developers at a time when landfill issues were before your commission? Was it sound judgment when you didn't pay federal taxes over several years, resulting in federal tax liens? Was it sound judgment when you refused to pay multiple debts, resulting in lawsuits and garnishments against you? Was it sound judgment when you filed bankruptcy, which got suspended because you failed to pay the people you had promised?
Okay, Ms.
Is that
McKinney.
what you mean by sound judgment?
Again, desperate acts. You're at it again, Congresswoman McKinney. The politics of personal destruction. I believe that this is a campaign for the United States Congress, and if you look at Congresswoman McKinney's record, she's absolutely failed to deliver any meaningful legislation to this district. 64 measures introduced by this Congresswoman over 12 years, only one passed. It was a measure to rename a post office, and that's a pitiful record for a Congresswoman.
Would you like to rebut that?
I absolutely would, because, you know, Mr. Johnson has been given some talking points, but they don't conform with the facts. The fact of the matter is Congress.org did a ranking of members of Congress, and I rank highest on legislation of all of the Democrats in the Georgia delegation, including Congressman John Lewis.
Cynthia McKinney, you have a second question for Mr. Johnson.
Yes, I do. Mr. Johnson, in your campaign song, you ask, do you want a congressman who represents your values? Whose values are you talking about? the values of supporters of the Republican Party who contributed over $16,000 to your campaign? Or is it the values of the developers and landfill operators who contributed thousands of dollars to your campaign? Or is it the very own personal values that include ethics violations, tax liens, and garnishments? Are these the values that you intend to take to Washington, D.C.? I don't think that those are values that the people
Let him answer the question.
deserve.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. Congresswoman McKinney's disclosure forms show that 4 of the top 5 zip codes reflecting where her contributions came from are from out of the state of Georgia, whereas just about all of the money that I have raised has come from inside the state of Georgia. So my money comes from my constituents. Her money comes from out of state. Her ad says that if I take money, then someone controls me. The question is, who controls you, Congresswoman McKinney, when you take money from Los Angeles, people in Las Vegas, people in New York? Who do you really represent? I represent the people of the 4th Congressional District. That's who I'm concerned with.
Ms. McKinney, you have an answer for that?
I certainly do, because unfortunately, Mr. Johnson's contributors are Republicans, people who represent landfills and developers. And my contributors are the people. My special interest is the people. Mr. Johnson doesn't know how to say no to the special interests.
Thank you. This concludes the round for now. Hank Johnson, you can have now a second question of Ms. McKinney.
Yes, Ms. McKinney, we've established that you don't show up for work, and now I want to talk about who you represent. You made utterly false claims that I'm a candidate of outside interest in this race, but let's review the facts. The top 2 zip codes giving money to your campaign are in California and Las Vegas. Fully 2/3 of your contributions are from out of state, in contrast to under 4% of mine. In a recent campaign ad, you said if they take their money, if I take their money, then I'm their man. Again, Congresswoman McKinney, who do you really represent?
I represent the people, and I'm so glad you asked that question. I don't have Republicans giving me votes, and I don't have Republicans giving me money. I don't have landfill operators or those who represent them giving me money. I don't have developers who who you allow to build high-density housing and then put our children in trailers. Those people are not the ones who are footing the bill for my campaign. My campaign is financed by the people.
Rebuttal, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, as I said earlier, Ms. McKinney knows full well that I've never taken any contributions from any landfill operator. I've been the one to stop the proliferation of landfills in DeKalb County. When it comes down to contributions from developers, developers are people that work for the benefit of commercial development and residential development, and we've had measured smart growth in DeKalb County, and I'm proud of my record as a county commissioner.
May I respond?
But there's not one thing that Congresswoman McKinney has done legislatively that has been good for the 4th
Thank you very much.
District.
Very briefly.
I suppose that's why we had a 10 million gallon sewage spill, and why the people of DeKalb County now have to boil their water because of smart growth. It hasn't been smart growth, Mr. Johnson, and you've been responsible for supporting the developers who have put our children in trailers and who have overdeveloped our communities.
Okay, thank you very much. That is it for our second round of questioning. For our third round, we return to our panel of journalists who will ask questions of the candidates of his or her choice. The candidates will be allowed 1 minute to respond. Again, as moderator, I will determine if the opposing candidate will be given 30 seconds for rebuttal. We begin this round with a question from David Zelski of Georgia Public Broadcasting.
Ms. McKinney, you chose not to attend or respond to the Atlanta Press Club debates for the 4th Congressional earlier this month. Why was that, and why did you choose to attend this one?
I'm so happy that you asked that question, because I have district days that are announced at the beginning of the year. I also have important meetings in the congressional office. On the day, this is the 4th time, by the way, that Mr. Johnson and I have been together at a community forum or a debate such as this. We had a session for our mayors and our police chiefs with the Department of Homeland Security called Accessing Washington during the time that you scheduled your debate. The other debate was scheduled during a day that was advertised in January for our district day.
James Salser, you have a question for one of the candidates?
Yes, Congresswoman, your campaign has insinuated essentially that Republicans crossed over, and that's the reason, or one of the reasons for not making it out of the primary. Your opponent, since the primary, has received contributions from prominent Republicans such as Guy Milner, GOP contributors like Bernie Marcus traditionally gives to national Democratic groups, or excuse me, Republican groups. However, he's also received $2,000 from Democratic governor, former Governor Roy Barnes, and Democratic gubernatorial nominee Mark Taylor has refused to endorse you, even though you are an incumbent Congresswoman. What does Barnes' support of Mr. Johnson and Taylor's non-endorsement say about you and your candidacy?
The bottom line is Mark Taylor is running his race, and I'm running mine. But the other bottom line is that during the primary itself, over $16,000 of Republican money went into Mr. Johnson's campaign coffers. And that included people who supported Republicans who were challenging the extension of the Voting Rights Act. Mr. Johnson chose to take money from people who were against the Voting Rights Act.
Would you like to respond to that, Mr. Johnson?
Yes, I would. As I stated earlier, my contributions came in at an amount of $130,000 for the primary. I made it into the primary. In the runoff, we've had over 650 different people that have donated to this campaign, mostly in denominations of $250, $100, $25, $50, to take several donations that came in from a couple of Republicans. And by the way, Bernie Marcus is the gentleman that built the Georgia Aquarium. He's a man who is about good for the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta. To take a few donations and to put the spotlight on those is really unfair.
Alexis Scott, no, we need to move forward. Alexis Scott, your question,
Okay.
please.
All right, thank you. My question is for Mr. Johnson. A lot of your campaign focused on you being an alternative to Cynthia McKinney in terms of behavior. How are your political positions different from hers?
Well, number one, I am a candidate who builds consensus. I have dialogue with people who I work with, both on the Democratic side of the aisle, and I'll also strive to maintain good relationships with people on the opposite side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle. The Republicans are in office now. They have the majority, and so you simply must work with them in order to be effective. And you also must have good relations with your own delegation, people in the state of Georgia delegation, as well as in the Democratic Party, which refused to grant Ms. McKinney her seniority upon her return. So her relations are bad. She can't work with people. If you can't work with people, you can't get anything done in Congress. I'll be a different congressman.
Go right ahead, Ms. McKinney.
I would just like to say that he's saying that he supports the Republicans. He's going to go up to Washington and be just like them. If you take money from Republicans, if you take votes from Republicans, then you have to be one of the Republicans' men in Congress. I am a proud, independent Democrat who represents people with passion and conviction. Let me also just say that when it comes to getting money, Noise Wall, I got Lantern Ridge, $500,000 this year. Peachtree Industrial Boulevard, $200,000
Okay, we're not going to have time for you to go down the whole list,
year.
Ms. McKinney. David, your question.
I'd like to add on to the previous question for Mr. Johnson. Your website and many of the blogs seem to focus primarily on replacing Ms. McKinney. Do you feel like the people of the 4th Congressional really know what your issues are when that is your primary focus?
Yes, because we've been out since January of 2008 talking with the voters, letting them know what our concerns were, what our issues were. We've been listening to them to hear their issues. We know that economic development and jobs is the top issue, along with education. Not one measure has been introduced by Congresswoman McKinney regarding education, even though it's her top priority. it'll certainly be mine, and when it comes time to vote, I'll be there. I'm concerned about health care. Cynthia McKinney missed a vote on health care for community clinics. Community clinics are lacking in the 4th Congressional District, but she missed that vote. I'll be there when it comes time for me to vote. Moreover, I'll be working with my colleagues in Congress on both sides of the aisle to effect legislation that benefits the people of the 4th Congressional District.
I need to respond.
Go right ahead.
Thank you very much, because Hank Johnson says that he's going to go up to Washington and basically be quiet. He's talking about jobs. I've put 500 people in a program called the National Youth Apprenticeship Collaboration, where people can earn and learn. We've put 500 of them in this program that I initiated. Also, the largest sewage spill in DeKalb County history. He's concerned about health. Don't overdevelop and overtax our infrastructure in DeKalb County.
Okay,
but
thank you very much.
his relationship with the developers.
James, your question for one of the candidates.
This is for Commissioner Johnson. On your website, on the issue of education, you say, there is nothing more essential to the success of our nation than education. We owe our children the best schools, the best teachers, the best supplies and programs. Yet, in that little synopsis you have, there's nothing that says, that explains what exactly you would do. It kind of has generalities. Can you name 2 specific things that you go to, if you go to Congress, 2 specific things you say we ought to do, this is what's going to get this done?
Yes, we need universal health care coverage for all people, especially those who cannot...
This is on education. I'm saying on education. What would
on education. Oh, okay. On education, let me say that the NIAC program that Cynthia McKinney talks about, that has 500 people enrolled, has not even been funded yet. And so she's not telling the truth about that. There are no people working in the NIAC program. As far as education is concerned, we need to amend the No Child Left Behind Act to make sure that we remove some of the rigid requirements for measuring success of both schools and school systems. And secondly, we need to give teachers, we need to empower teachers with the tools that they need to teach our students effectively. We need to give them the kind of assistance for aids that take away some of the administrative problems that have been hoisted upon them by the No Child Left Behind Act. And we also need to pay our teachers. I'm glad that the federal government has acknowledged a role in education, but they have left a lot of unfunded mandates.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
And so
I want to give you a chance to respond to him saying that the program you touted has not been funded.
Obviously, Mr. Johnson speaks about that which he does not know. I would also just like to say, because of his cozy relationship with builders and developers, the children in DeKalb County are learning in trailers. We also have money in the budget in this current appropriation cycle for our National Youth Apprenticeship Collaboration. Obviously, Mr. Johnson has been given talking points, and they haven't been updated.
Thank you very much, Ms. McKinney. The time for questions has expired. It's now time for closing statements from each of our candidates in Georgia's Democratic primary runoff for Georgia's 4th District. Each candidate will have 30 seconds. The order of the closing statements was randomly determined before the broadcast. The first statement will come from Hank Johnson.
Thank you. I'm going to be an effective legislator. I'm not going to be a divisive one who polarizes and divides people and then sits back and does nothing. I will be present when it comes time to vote on the matters that concern you. I will propose legislation, and I'll work with the colleagues that I have to make sure that we can pass meaningful legislation, such as the predatory lending law that I passed in DeKalb County. I was an effective commissioner. It was during difficult times, but we succeeded. These are difficult times for our nation, and it's time for us to apply solutions and not politics.
Thank you very much. Ms. McKinney, your closing remarks.
Thank you very much. An ordinance which was found unconstitutional, written by an attorney. Dr. King reminded us that the measure of a man is where he stands in challenge and controversy. I stand alongside our troops and our veterans, working families, and Mr. Clark, who could get no help from Mr. Johnson when his land was swallowed up by a landfill. Eisenhower reminds us that every dollar spent on war is a theft from the people, and I've brought more than $350 million. Send me back to Washington so I can speak truth to power.
Thank you very much. That concludes our debate. Our thanks to the candidates and to our panel of journalists. We'd also like to thank Tom Watson Brown for his support and the Atlanta Press Club for arranging tonight's debate. For more information about the Atlanta Press Club and tonight's candidates and future debates, log on to www.atlantapressclub.org. The debates aired on Georgia Public Broadcasting will be archived at that website. We invite you to tune in for the debate between the Republican candidates for Secretary of State tomorrow at 7 p.m. here on GPB. I'm Morris Diggs. Thanks for joining us for Debates 2006.